My name is Julius Baltraki, Department of Literature and Film Studies, as you know. And I want to thank you for coming, welcome to this session. So today, we're looking at the World Medieval. It's a public lecture, and my job here is now to introduce the presenter, and it's a big honor for me. Our presenter today is Professor Richard Scott Nokes of Kampala, and he's a visiting professor from the Department of English at Troy University, Alabama, in the United States of America. He's an expert in AI, especially used in academia or education, and is a seasoned winner of multiple grants. So he's an expert in there. And he's currently conducting research in modern Ugandan societies, especially the oral part of it, and how that even speaks to the wider world. So he's also an acclaimed researcher and publisher in medieval scholarship, for which the process is open for session. And he's currently teaching LT 206, creative writing to 5 years. He has offered a series of presentations, not only in AI, global medievalism, digital publishing, and today's presentation on global medievalism is the last of the 3 closed sessions for students. Of course, maybe as a department, because he has an annexation of his stay here, so as a department, we will probably discuss with him and see if maybe there might be more presentations to deliver for students. And nobody said much, so I want you to join me in welcoming today's presenter, Richard Scott Nokes of Kampala. Thank you.
Thank you. So I should also note for any of you who are from Busoga, I'm also Ngobi, so as well. And if I don't have a name from your language, it's your fault for not inviting me yet. So I should mention that this is part of the Fulbright series of lectures. So I was brought here by Fulbright, which is an exchange program that brings, that's about education and cultural exchange between the United States and other countries. So we bring some scholars, lecturers and such from here to the United States. We send some from the United States abroad also. So I do hope that some of you here will look into, for your own future, trying to apply for Fulbright funding. I also want to thank the Kyambogo, not just Kyambogo University broadly, but specifically the Department of Literature and Film Studies and the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. Been very, very kind. And of course, Troy University in Alabama in the United States, which is my home university. And I'm very glad that we have such a big crowd today, because the things that I'm talking about today received a lot of discussion among the lecturers in the department. A lot who had, who want to push back against some things that I said, a lot who want to agree with some things I said, and so I think we should have a really interesting discussion afterward. Okay, so let's talk about what this means, the global medieval, because I think some of you might not know exactly what this means. So sometimes when people, so the word medieval is the same as the word Middle Ages. It's a kind of Latin version of that same thing. They picture things like knights and castles and the plague. And most importantly, I think for what we're talking about today, they picture Europe. But in fact, that picture leaves out, most of the world. And the medieval period doesn't belong to Europe. I'm not European, so that would leave me out too. It belongs to everyone. And Uganda has one of the richest medieval traditions in the world. But it hasn't been as well explored. That's not true. It hasn't been explored as a medieval period very much up until recently. So tonight we're going to define the medieval. We're going to travel through it globally, what it means, and we're going to look at common patterns that show up everywhere. These common patterns are, for most of you, what's going to be important. For those lecturers who are in the other one, I'm going to leave out most of the theory because, you know, I'm not going to hassle the students with that stuff. Okay, so one problem with the medieval is it often gets defined in a kind of European context. And so as I mentioned before, the word medieval comes from the word medium aevo, middle age, the middle time, right? So we take medium aevo and we push it together to make this word medieval. And so a kind of standard definition that people will sometimes use is the European one. Europe between the fall of the Roman Empire to things like the printing press, discovery of the New World. Those are, so as I probably won't get into today much, but in different fields we sometimes treat the medieval differently, but basically 1,000 years, from around 500 AD to around 1500 AD. So about 1,000 years. So what, if it's in the middle, it is between two things, right, by definition. It's between two things. And one of those things, we have a mouse here. This is, whoa, hey, you don't like my lecture. You see that? That's like my students scurrying away when I'm coming with the marks. They scurry far away. It has to be between two things. And most importantly, it's what it's before. And that is before the modern era. But what does the word modern mean? So in fact, it just means the most recent time. People in every era have called themselves modern. The word modern comes to English from Latin and from the word modernus, because the Romans 2,000 years ago called themselves modernists. Well, we would not consider them modern or moderns today, so really modern is always the most recent time. Okay, well, that really then begs the question, when does the modern begin? So for literature, we usually say the modern begins with the arrival of the printing press. As soon as you can have literature that's printed and the cost of books becomes much cheaper, but every copy of a book becomes the same. They're not copied by hand. It's not orally given, but it's printed out on a printing press. That's where we come into the modern era for literature. But the word pre-modern, sometimes people like to use the word pre-modern to refer to the medieval. I don't like the term pre-modern because the term pre-modern includes everything. That includes the medieval period, it includes a classical period, very, very ancient periods. It even includes anything from before humanity, right? That's pre-modern. So I don't really like that. So if I use the word pre-modern, I really mean all the time before now. And if I use the word medieval, I'm talking about a specific kind of time. So in the European medieval, we talk about the end of the classical era, really the fall of the Roman Empire. But the truth is, most of the world was not part of the Roman Empire, so that does not apply to most of the world. And so instead, it's better to define the medieval by certain features. And we're going to talk about those features because the medieval comes later or comes earlier and leaves later or leaves earlier in different places of the world, depending on what was going on historically in that place. So things like industrialization, mass literacy, and the nation state. To give a sense of this in Ugandan context, If we go back 200 years in Uganda, it's very difficult to find people who can read and write in any language, right? But today, Uganda struggles with somewhere around 1 in 4 people are illiterate. That's still 75% literacy. That's a very, very high level of literacy, right? I mean, if we were to take someone from 200 years ago and right here and bring them to Uganda today, they would say, oh my gosh, everyone is a genius today, right? They would be amazed. They would be amazed, right? And then also things like nation states, right? So it depends on the field we're looking at. When we talk about medieval warfare, as soon as you have widespread gunpowder, we start to say that's the end of the Middle Ages. With art, it's going to be different things. So, but today I'm going to focus on literature. The arrival of the printing press, that's the nearly universal dividing line. And so we end up in the modern era when we get the printing press, and then we're leaving the medieval literature. Now, as I said before, I alluded to this, the medieval begins at different times in different places, depending on what was going on historically in that place. So in the Americas, so where I'm from, we usually begin, if we're going to talk about medieval time, we're talking about the modern era begins with the Columbian Exchange. We do have some archaeological evidence of both Europeans and some Asians entering into the North America, usually, entering into the Americas before this time, but those were brief, they were not permanent settlements, there was not a real exchange. Right? But then after that exchange begins, is the incredible changes that occur. And so we would say that's the beginning of the modern era in those places. And so the time before that would be medieval. If we take China, for example, some scholars date the medieval from the fall of the Han Dynasty, which would be in the 3rd century. Others from the Tang Dynasty, 7th century. My own studies have been in the Tang Dynasty. I don't have a very strong feeling about the 4 centuries before, whether we count those or not. But you can see it's very flexible, right? It's very flexible. In North Africa, we usually start with the rise of Islam. Right? When Islam comes, that starts the beginning of medieval religion. And so sometimes we think about that as, okay, well then, that is maybe how we might start the beginning of the Middle Ages. Europe, of course, we have modern warfare, we have gunpowder. Modern religion begins with the Reformation. This is an interesting one when we talk about religious history, because you can only get the Reformation when you have the ability for everyone to read the Bible. And you can only have the ability for everyone to read the Bible once you have the printing press. So by necessity in Europe, the medieval period for religion carried on later than the medieval period for literature. However, in Uganda, it was all pretty quick, right? All came pretty quickly across. And so, I'm just using those to illustrate this point to you. You can't be very dogmatic about this. You cannot say, this is the year that the Middle Ages begins everywhere around the world in all times. Anything before this is medieval, anything after this is modern. It doesn't work that way. It has to do more with certain features that we'll see, certain distinctive features. Okay, so obviously then, we have to talk about, I want to very briefly talk about the medieval around the world. I'm going to talk a little bit about Europe, but in fact, I really want to talk about a global tradition here. Okay, so Islam, right? You really get with Islam. By the way, one of the things that leads to medieval worlds, leads to medieval changes often, are religions that have holy books, right? Religions that have holy books. Because one thing, if you have a holy book in your religion, not every religion has it. In fact, most religions don't have a holy book. If you have a holy book and you say, you need to read this, right? This book is the inspired word of God, or this book was written before creation and was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, or whatever the thing is. As soon as you begin to have a religion that says this, then suddenly, what does that require? Well, if we want people to read this book, or to know about this book, we need to suddenly start working on literacy, we need to start publishing things, we need to try to drive the cost of books down, we need schools. Many things that we associate with the medieval come because people said, hey, we have a holy book. And in Islam, of course, the Quran really functions in that way. So we can, although we can begin with the rise of Islam, the Middle Ages, and I would begin them a little earlier than this. Certainly by the time we get to the 8th and the 13th century, Baghdad is really a kind of intellectual capital in the world, right? And we would consider that to be one of these times. There's this really a great translation movement that we see. Greek, Persian, Indian texts. Those are gathered together, they're preserved. Other people read them and they build upon them, right? This is true, by the way. Obviously, once again, I'm focusing on literature. Anyone here who knows about Islamic art will know that this was a real, and Islamic medicine also will know this was a real time of growth. And we consider this coming out of the classical or ancient time and moving into the Middle Ages. So we get the Arabian Nights, we get Rumi, and all kinds of really important literary stuff. We have real important things going on in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy. These are all medieval transformations that occur. And so this is similar to the kind of things we get in China, similar to the kinds of things that we get in Europe, right? Where you just have this sometimes people want to talk about this as a time of blossoming or a time of growth, and it can be a time of growth, but I think at least we would say a time of massive change. Even if you prefer what came before, you cannot deny the change that these things bring. Tang Dynasty China, one of my favorites. This is a great time of lyric poetry. I mentioned that before, the Tang Dynasty, the fall of the Han Dynasty for sure. And of course, so in China, because you have these dynastic traditions, we then, whenever people argue, they argue about which dynasty is the medieval dynasty, which dynasty is the modern dynasty, this, that, okay, right? Japan, you get things like the Tale of Genji, the Pillow Book of Seishonagon, other kinds of very important works that aren't just in those languages in that time, but are markedly different. So for example, many scholars consider the Tale of Genji to be the first psychological novel. I don't agree with that, but I don't think it's a stupid thing to say, and it makes a lot of sense. And the Pillow Book of Seishonagon were written by women of the imperial court in Japan. We get, again, this kind of, in East Asia, a vast body of literature. This is produced, it's copied, and debated across the centuries. Some people will talk about a kind of block printing that was similar to the printing press. It is arguably a kind of printing press, but doesn't have because of the ideographic writing, it doesn't have the same kind of socially transformative function that you get with the printing press. Later on, you get Buddhist traditions, epic histories, dozens of languages growing up, a lot of change happening in East Asia at this time. Now let's go to my homeland, the Americas. One of the first big research projects I ever did, this is 20 plus years ago, was on something called the Popol Vuh. I should also mention that research trip was also funded by a Fulbright Hayes program. So it only took me 20 some odd years to come back to Fulbright. And that's the great Quiche Maya creation story. And it is a pre-Columbian, that is to say, before the coming of the Europeans. We only have copies that were made after the Europeans, but we have these things. And it's really, it doesn't have the same, as soon as the Europeans come and there's this exchange, you suddenly get massive change in this culture, right? Change caused by a couple things. One, obviously, is the coming of Christianity. These old religions are very quickly abandoned as Christianity comes. The other thing, actually, is just the exchange of resources. So, for example, horses. There were no horses in the Americas before the Columbian Exchange, so they get horses, right? Pigs. There are no pigs until this time, right? There are massive changes that happen there. And of course, they have things to export like tobacco, rubber, other kinds of things like that. Turkey, I've seen turkeys all over out in the villages here in Uganda. Of course, turkeys come from the New World, right? So that exchange you get that changes every part of the world, that kind of all happens at once. All of that, so the Inca, the Aztec, Inca, and other traditions, they had their own oral traditions, and we have this in certain kind of pictographic structures. We actually don't, because of the amount of evidence, because we don't have enough evidence to put them together, we don't have as many stories as we would like from this time, but we do know about their society a great deal. Of course, it's not influenced by Europe because the coming of Europeans starts that Columbian exchange where eventually you end up with turkeys in Uganda, right? You end up with turkeys and tobacco and chocolate. Do you like chocolate? Yeah, well, guess what you didn't have until this happened, right? No chocolate, no vanilla, no turkeys, no rubber, right? No, there's no football without the Columbian exchange. This sport could not exist as it was. And so we have some really interesting artifacts like something called the Dresden Codex, which I might talk about later. This is one of the few surviving Maya books from the Quiche Maya. Now getting closer to home for you, West Africa. Close, getting closer. We do have things like the Sundiata epic from the Mali Empire. We've got traditions, royal courts, praise poetry, a lot of things that now feel more similar to what you would think of as traditional Ugandan culture, right? Philosophical, riddles, storytelling. Now, why don't we consider these modern? Well, we don't consider them modern because we haven't yet entered into the time of the printing press. They are only expressed orally and then maintained orally. So oral, I'm about to say oral poetry, not just oral poetry, but all oral literature, it has its own sophistications that are different than the sophistications of literature in the time of the printing press. We also have, without getting into the details, we also have complicated things. So like, I mentioned Mali up here. We happen to know that empire has a very, very vast historical tradition that we don't have access to because of taboos about sharing them outside of the royal family, which no longer exists in the same way it did before. So we've lost a lot of things there because of that. Okay, so let's talk about Uganda, where we are today. All right. So we've got in the Great Lakes region here, by the way, just a little side note, my wife, Namakula, and I, we come from an area near the Great Lakes originally we come from an area near the Great Lakes in America, so we also are from the Great Lakes region, just different Great Lakes. Every time someone says the Great Lakes region, I have a moment where I get confused. I think, wait, what? Am I back home? The Bunyoro, Chitara, and Kole, others. these were sophisticated pre-modern societies. So you've got levels of organization, you've got levels of sophistication, but they are not what we consider modern societies because they don't have the same kinds of structures, right, that you would have. So, you know, we do have these elaborate political constructions, performers, genealogical traditions. We've got sacred kingships, oral traditions, etc. And I'm talking here, frankly, just to be clear, so I'm talking here about Uganda very broadly. But of course, this is going to be very, very different in different parts of Uganda, right? So the Nyoro kingdom has a kind of peak before the kingdom of Uganda, et cetera, et cetera. And so these are going to be different also in different places. And so when you just think about Uganda itself, how you could say like, well, we kind of enter into a medieval period in this part of Uganda around this time, but this other part of Uganda around that time. Now take that to the global scale. So even when I say like, in China, it was like such and such. Well, remember, we're painting with a very broad brush there, right? We're painting with a very, very broad brush. But the defining features, we still have these defining features of medieval culture on this continent and here, more specifically, in this region. So let's talk about literature. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I'm not going to try to overly define this because, frankly, I've got a lot of colleagues here who are way more specialized in this than I am. They just have not been thinking about this as part of the global tradition, right? So I just really vaguely want to talk about it. It's across multiple languages. We've got all kinds of genres that we will see. You know, I spent this weekend in the Seychelles Islands interviewing storytellers, and we had everything from animal tales, tales about histories, tales about ancestors, genealogies of ancestral lines, tales about gods. These are the kinds of things that you'll see all around the world. And these are complicated. And they do require kind of specialist training. And we say specialist training. Now, I had an interesting conversation with a gentleman this weekend who we had asked to tell us so we could record some of his oral stories. And he was, on the one hand, eager to do that, but on the other hand said, I don't have any formal education. And he felt like he was not qualified to tell the stories. And I think what he didn't understand, and we talked about it, I think he did by the end, was he did have training. It just wasn't sitting in a classroom or looking at looking at a slide deck while someone stands with a microphone and talks to you about these things, right? He had other kinds of specialist training, and that's not new. That's the kind of thing you see throughout medieval literature. And this is an important thing to think about too. And I will say some storytellers would find this a controversial statement. So I want to make sure I clarify that. We would consider an oral story, every performance, in a sense, to be its own story. Every performance is in some ways its own story. Now, of course, in some ways it isn't, right? You're retelling the story that you were told by your grandfather, who was told by his grandfather, et cetera, et cetera. Your grandmother sat down and told you this animal story to teach you lessons, and you're trying to tell it the same way. But no matter how, even if you say the words in the exact same way, if you're saying it at night versus the daytime, the dog barking in the background, the mouse that comes running across, while you're doing this, all these things will affect it. Some of the storytellers felt very strongly, we've talked about, feel very strongly, say, no, when I'm telling it to you, I'm adapting it to the audience. I know the story as I was taught by my grandmother, and I'm adapting it to you as an audience, right? And other storytellers are like, I am not deviating at all. This is exactly as I was taught, and no one should ever tell a story differently. So I would say academically, we are very aware of that tension in oral storytelling. But that's something that a lot of you I know are studying here, so I don't want to get too far into it because, as I said, we have a lot of colleagues here who are a lot more adept at that part than I am. So sometimes we talk about the term orature. Have you come across this in your classes? Do your lecturers talk about this term orature? Okay. And of course, this is what's interesting about this term is, on the one hand, it's a really significant contribution in modern literature. It's not a very significant contribution for medieval and classical literature, and ancient literature, because medieval, classical, ancient literature already thought about oral literature as real literature, right? This was a kind of old idea. But for modern literature, which comes in the age of the printing press, sometimes people say, if you say it, it's not real literature, right? So it did need to be pushed back against. And so the field here, modern literature, literary field, is kind of catching up to what Pio Azeru said. But in terms of like what we do in the global medieval, this was kind of already something we already knew. All right. So we have this interesting problem of the living archive. I came here to Uganda to do a couple of different things. One was to look at archives of existing stories that either never been published or been published in book, fell out of print, and also to interview storytellers to find stories that had never been put in print, or if they've been put in print, no one remembers where or when, and they cannot be located. But this is not, for medieval scholars, this idea is not new. So let's take Beowulf. The Beowulf manuscript, which we see over, oh wait, do I have the right manuscript there? Yeah, the Beowulf manuscript exists in only one version. Only one manuscript survived. So that's the only one that we've got. And so if you're like, I'm going to read the ancient work of, the medieval work of Beowulf, you've only got one choice. It has places where it's so damaged by fire and by water and also by glue in some places, that it's unreadable, and we can't get those words back. So when you are a European medievalist, you try to reconstruct then, as much as you can from what evidence you can, what an oral tradition might have looked like. Almost everything that we have in the Middle Ages, of the European Middle Ages, and the rest of the world, comes from a time when most people could not read. So when it's written down by someone who can read, but they heard it as part of an oral tradition. So what we get in medieval literature is in some ways an arrested version of an oral literary work. Now sometimes, in some cases, we have multiple copies of it, but usually not. So something very exciting happened a couple of weeks ago. In English, for example, very rarely is any new English from the Middle Ages discovered. A new discovery of one of the oldest English poems was found. And on the one hand, that's very exciting. On the other hand, it happens to be one of the poems that we already have many, many, many copies of. So we didn't actually learn that much more as we might have if we'd gotten a whole new poem, but we do have something new, right? In Uganda, the moment the printing press came, it isn't like oral traditions stopped. They stopped being accessed the way they were before, but it's still alive, it's still performing. And for someone like me, that's very exciting. Because when I look at when I went to study the Popol Vuh in Guatemala, no one who could speak that language was still alive. They all died centuries ago. I could not talk to someone and say, what does this story mean? How do you think about this story, right? They were all dead. I had a Chinese scholar come and study with me and teach me about Tang Dynasty poetry, right? Even though she's Chinese, she is 1,000 years removed from the Tang Dynasty. All those people are dead, right? She cannot ask them. She cannot say, hey, would you perform this for me, right? And so this is very, very exciting. It's something that I think sometimes people, from a Ugandan perspective, you might think, hey, so you're here and you're going to preserve our literature for us and bring it out to the global stage and save it, etc. And all that's true. But the rest of the world is getting something too. We don't have that many living traditions left. And the ability to go and ask someone who's still alive and say, what does this story mean to you? How do you think about this story? That is something that Uganda can contribute to the rest of the world, because then we can take that evidence and say, okay, if the storytellers of Uganda think about it in such and such a way, what did the Tang Dynasty poets think? We can't ask them, but we can maybe extrapolate from that some ideas. All right. So before we get into what we mean by the medieval in terms of literature, I want to talk about something called archetypes. And this is a term, I've heard some students use it, and I've had some other students who aren't really familiar with it, so I'm going to go over it a little bit more than I would otherwise. Okay, so what's an archetype? These are patterns that recur across time, across cultures, often with not just no clear sign of transmission, but also with no possible method of transmission. Sometimes patterns just recur in stories across cultures, across centuries. So if something appears in Uganda and in medieval Japan and in ancient Egypt and in Aztec, art and in insert other things here, there's something important there. The problem we have with archetypes is they're very mysterious. They're really undeniable. They're really undeniable in their that they exist. But no one can explain why they exist. I have a I have a class in folklore and mythology that we study the archetypes of folklore and mythology in this class. And I assign every student a different philosopher or different thinker or different scholar of these things. And each one has to do a report. And we kind of move generally forward in time. Sometimes we cluster them according to kinds of ideas about archetypes of myth and folklore. But we kind of move forward. And if you go back to 150 years ago, there was great confidence. We will have a scientific understanding of where archetypes come from. We will know. We almost know it now, and we will know. And usually when students enter the class, they also think, oh, yeah, there's an easy scientific explanation to archetypes. It's because of this, or it's because of that. And by the end of the semester, not only when you ask the students, what do you think, why do you think there are archetypes, most of them go like, I don't even know anymore. I don't know what reality is anymore. But also, when you get closer and closer to today, after over a century of thought about this, you end up with things like, I don't know, the collective unconscious, God, like very mystical, not materialist, not scientific reasons for it. But we do see these patterns across time. And so this leads to this question about that we have to hold in tension when we talk about the global medieval, the universal and the particular. There are universal things. There are universal things in medieval literature across the world. Not just archetypes, but other kinds of patterns that we see occurring, we'll talk about these later, in medieval literature. But the problem is, if you're looking at a literature from another time period, and you're only focusing on those universals, you end up flattening them out, so that then all literature around the world feels the same, and the historical, cultural, religious, linguistic particularities of that story or of that literature, you lose those. And you lose something very important. On the other hand, if you only focus on the particulars, if you only say, look how this culture does something very strange and different than other cultures, you end up exoticizing these cultures, exoticizing their stories, and then you also lose something very important. So you always, in the studying the global medieval, in literature, but in art, in all forms, you always have this tension, this pull between what is universally true among all these things and what is true in the particular as well. By the way, I mentioned that one of the storytellers who I talked to this weekend, he was very concerned that he felt like he didn't have a formal education, maybe he couldn't. He raised this issue. So if you wonder, can you learn this without going to college? Yes, you can, right? Yes, you can. He had learned this issue. He actually asked specifically about this question. It was really fascinating how sophisticated his understanding was, having learned the stories in the traditional ways. All right, so let's talk about how we might think about these things. I want to show you a poem that was written by one of my creative writing students. This is written by one of my creative writing students, and let's go ahead and read her poem today. Love How I'd Love is the title. Love how I'd love to slip down to the pond, bathe with you close by on the bank. Just for you I'd wear my new Memphis swimsuit, made of sheer linen fit for a queen. Come see how it looks in the water. Couldn't I coax you to wade in with me? The cool creeps slowly around us. Then I'd dive deep down and come up for you dripping. Let you fill your eyes with the little red fish that I catch. And I'd say, staying there tall in the shallows, look at my fish, love, how it lies in my hand, and my fingers caress it and slip down its sides. But then I'd say, softer, eyes bright with your seeing, a gift, love, no words. Come closer and look, it's all me. What do you think this, and by the way, in case you're wondering, this student is not here today. Okay. What do you think she is like? What do you think she's like? Anyone have an idea? What do you think she's like? Can anyone tell me anything about this girl? Yes. Go ahead and pass this back to her.
I think that lady over there is in love.
What's that? She's in love? Is she very aggressive or not aggressive? Was that yes or no? You don't know? Okay. Does she seem like someone you might know? Some of you are like, not only do I know this girl, she is me, right? Some of you out here are like, yeah, this is me, right? This is how I think, right? I mean, this is a poem, and the poem, what is the difference in romantic relationships between men and women? There are many differences, but one is, for women, it's important to be seen. You need him to notice you. You need him to notice you, right? This is a poem. where this student of mine, she wants him to notice her. And she's thinking, I wish I could do this. I'd love to do this. Go down, show you who I am, you know, let you fill your eyes with the little red fish. They say softer, eyes bright with your seeing. Right? She's like, I want you to notice me. Why don't you notice me? Now, none of you here, none of the ladies here have ever felt this way, right? None of the ladies here have ever felt like, why does this guy never notice me, right? Do you all recognize my student here? Do you know her? You might not know her name, but you know people like this, and maybe this is you. But as your lecturers here already know, I'm a liar. You cannot trust me. I told you a lie. And the lie is that this was written by one of my creative writing students. This poem is from about 3,400 years ago. This poem is from thousands of years ago in Egypt. That's why it mentions Memphis, Egypt. Some Egyptian girl, thousands of years ago, wanted some Egyptian boy to see her. And he just didn't notice her. And so she fantasized about how she would get his attention. And she wrote a poem that survives today. Every time I teach world literature in America, on the second day of class, I show them this poem. I also lie to them. No one trusts me in this world. I'm a terrible liar. And the point I'm making to them in that context is they have to take that class. And sometimes they think, hey, why do I care about this? These are people who lived thousands of years ago in a country I've never been to. I don't care. But when I tell them the same thing was written by someone they might know, they immediately recognize the universal, right? They recognize this is as true today, right here at Kyambogo University, of some women in this room, as it was thousands of years ago on the other end of the Nile, right? Just as true. And in case you're wondering, it's just as true for American students as well. One student one time, she said something like, I feel like you broke into my room and read my journal, right? Because it was so much like it. There is always this is not medieval, this is ancient, but this I think gives a good sense of it. There is always something universal about great literature. So we can't ignore that, but we also have to always remember the particulars of that culture. All right, so we're going to talk about so let's talk about another issue, the kind of archetypes you might see. There's one of the sacred king. So we see often in literature the king's body and the fertility of the land are intertwined. If something bad happens to the king, something bad happens to the land, right? Or sometimes the reverse. If something bad happens to the land, the king suddenly is in bad health, right? The king's body is connected to this. We've got this everywhere around the world, that kind of thing. What about tricksters? We've got tricky animals often. They're not always animals, but often tricky. I think it's often a hare in Ugandan literature, is that right? In American literature, it's often a rabbit, very similar to a hare. The coyote, it's a kind of dog-like animal in the Americas. It's an important part of that. Actually, a god called this the fox, also in Europe. Yes, so the trickster figure who almost can change reality is a part of this, right? So we see these patterns throughout literature. And that's why you can pick up something that was written 500 years ago in a continent that you'll never go to in your life maybe, and still go, I recognize that. I recognize that. However, we have to be very humble about this. We have to be very humble about this. And some of you have heard me say this before, because it's very important to me. In the story of the Popol Vuh, the medieval Maya story, the version that we have, there's a goddess. Her name is Blood Moon. So Blood Moon is not a thing, it's a goddess. She's a daughter of one of the death gods there. Blood Moon. And there is a tree that they're not supposed to go to. The death gods say, don't go to that tree. There's a forbidden tree. And Blood Moon, who's a young virgin that's important to the story, she goes to the tree even though she's not supposed to. And on the tree, there's a skull growing as a fruit, a kind of forbidden fruit. And the skull talks to her. And it says, hold out your hand. And she holds out her hand, and the skull spits in the palm of her hand. And she becomes pregnant as a virgin. And then she gives birth to hero twins who save the world, or make the world safe for humanity, the kind of saviors of humanity, these hero twins. Ishbalanke and Unpo. Well, many of you here who know the Christian traditions will say, that sounds really, really Christian to me, right? Like, and since the only copy that we have that really has this, the only copy we have that tells us the story in a language that we can access today comes after the Spaniards came, many scholars looked at this at first and said, so there was the original story, but we don't have it anymore. We don't have it anymore because now we see the influence of Christianity. We see the story of Eve in the Garden of Eden, and then that gets put onto this, and then we also have the virgin birth of Jesus, and that all gets smushed together into this story, and we don't have the original version. Except, we have archaeological evidence showing us. Oh my gosh, I put the wrong picture on. Well, a different picture than this one. We have archaeological evidence from centuries before the coming of the Europeans and the coming of Christianity depicting this same thing. So you have to be very careful when you see something in two cultures that are the same. You have to be very, very humble about saying this is borrowed from that culture, or this is not borrowed from that culture. You have to be very humble about that because you never know. And if we didn't have this artwork, we would be convinced that this story had been changed after the coming of the Europeans, the Spanish, to the Americas, but in fact it's not. Okay. The last section of things I want to talk about are really the common elements of the global medieval literature. So if you're saying like, okay, well now I want to know not just how Uganda fits into this, but maybe I am interested in Turkish literature from the Middle Ages, right? Or the literature of India in the Middle Ages. What are the things that are the common elements? Of course, we always have to remember they're particular. These common elements are expressed according to the linguistic, cultural, literary, religious particulars of those. All right. The first one is the most obvious one. It's what we've been talking about a little bit already. And that is oral and manuscript culture. If we say before the printing press, what do we mean by before the printing press? What was there? Well, there was literature. It was orally transmitted and often written by manuscript, written down by manuscript. And that's something that we see around the world. So in, say, Chinese, in Chinese and Indian and European literature, with those literature, Japanese, I should say, with East Asian, Asian subcontinent, European, you have a long manuscript culture tradition where people are writing things down in whatever language it is, right? right? And we often have those preserved for us. But other parts of the world, Africa, for example, Australia, the Americas, we don't have it. We only have the oral tradition, and then suddenly, boom, the printing press comes suddenly to them, right? And we don't have this interregnum manuscript culture. So whichever it is, whether it has a manuscript or doesn't have a manuscript, each one is going to be different. Every manuscript is going to be different. Even if it's the same words, each manuscript is its own work of art. So for example, I've done some manuscript work in the British Library. And so people can go to the British Library and they can look at the original manuscripts. However, not everyone can go. So I could only go because I had training from someone who had already been the, I think at Cambridge, he was the director of the manuscript room in Cambridge. And he wrote me a letter of recommendation. And so somewhere at home, I've got a library card that says I can access these manuscripts. If I didn't have that recommendation, they would not let me do it. Why? Well, because they are also priceless artifacts themselves. Each manuscript is its own priceless artifact itself, right? Just in the same way that each telling of a story by a different storyteller is its own performance, its own unique performance. Each manuscript is its own unique thing too. Once you get the printing press, every copy, it should be the same as every other copy. So that's one of them. We've talked about that a lot, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. Okay, religious cosmology. Something that my earliest research as a graduate student was in medieval magic and medicine. And I will tell you that many Westerners struggle with the conflation of magic and medicine in medieval work, because they think of magic as one thing and medicine as a different thing. And I would also say popular religion as another thing, where in fact, not just medieval Europe, but around the world, life is not compartmentalized that way. So maybe I am sick because of a virus, but I can also be sick from that virus because of a spiritual influence. It isn't either or. It's not either you are sick because of the spiritual influence or you are sick because of a virus, but maybe the spiritual influence caused you to get the virus, right? These kinds of things are really important to how all of life is considered, right? And so when we get to secular religion, the idea, secular literature, the idea that there can be a literature that is in some way divorced from the spirit world, that's an entirely modern idea. You just cannot have that in most medieval literature. I do think we might be seeing movement away from that, but certainly that is an important element. And so if you want to understand a work of literature from the Middle Ages, you have to understand in some ways the particularities of their religious cosmology. Even if they don't talk about gods, still the gods in some way influence what's happening in the story, right? The characters are in some way connected, right? And so you have to think about them in this way. And of course, I do think that Uganda, being so close to its own medieval tradition, this is still true in Uganda, right? People still, I just spent some time at the Cultural Research Center in Busoga, and in my talks with the Father Richard, who runs that, he had a lot of interesting things to say, and in trying to preserve the culture of Busoga, he also, as a Catholic priest, he has very strong, theological presuppositions. But in that, he doesn't then separate those away from the material world, the spiritual, and the traditional beliefs there in the Kingdom of Busoga for the coming of Christianity, right? He holds those together, and that's pretty common as well. All right, kingship and kinship. You know, the nation state doesn't actually begin really even with, it really kind of begins later in the modern era. But the idea of a nation state, the idea of something like a Uganda and then somehow everyone in Uganda is supposed to think about themselves as one people, right? That's a very, very, very modern idea. It's a very modern idea. And it's not something that you will see in medieval works. And so you often have a loyalty to a lord, which is a kind of a personal connection. Even if you've never met that person, a personal connection. And so if I were to say, turn against my country in the United States, if I were to turn against America, I would be a traitor. I would be a traitor. However, I don't have any particular relationship with any of the leaders. Right? If, however, in the Middle Ages, I were to turn against my king, I would not only be a traitor, but I would also be betraying someone with whom I have a personal relationship with. Even if I don't personally know them, I am in a way directly connected to that person. And so treason in that context takes on a much more personal flavor than it would in the modern era. And so, I mean, big important questions are, you know, what do you owe your king when your king is wrong? If your king does something foolish, do you owe it to tell the king that he's being foolish, or do you owe it to follow the king through his foolishness? These are the kinds of questions which are really, things that you see often in global literature. And we see that throughout. I'm not going to get too much into it in the Ugandan context because, of course, it can enter into some contentious political debates. But in the Middle Ages, it's certainly important throughout the world. Formulaic composition. This is the important element. Because even when you have manuscript culture, most of the literature is based around oral culture, right? Orature. And oral literature relies on formulas. Sometimes with songs, sometimes repeated phrases. For example, I don't want to get too much into it, but in the early 20th century, a couple of scholars went to Serbia, which had at that time had very low literacy rates, and examined how the oral poets did it. And they found that an oral poet could hear a poem, could hear like an hour of poetry one time, and then repeat it back. Well, how did they do that? Well, they did it because they know the formulas. And they're able to put the formulas together. Even when they made a quote-unquote mistake, they did it within the formulas, so it still worked. And it still worked in that way. And we find that that's true around the world. It's the kind of way that a performance works. So, when I was a graduate student, there was a guy who would stand out in front. I studied in Detroit. There was a guy who, on rare occasions, would stand out in front of our building, and he would free rap. He would just for an hour rap. But he didn't have that much material. So he would rap about what was happening on the street, the cars he saw going by, he'd rap about those things. Well, how did he manage to do that so quickly? He didn't really compose it from scratch. He had a bunch of formulas that he put together. Stock phrases that he already knew rhymed with one another, or an internal meter to them, this kind of thing. And so he was able then, very quickly, to take that and assemble them together. I won't repeat any of them to you because it was very, very obscene what he would say on the street, but it worked as poetry. And we see that in Homer, which is classic. We see that in Beowulf. We see that in Ugandan oral poetry. We see around the world we see these kind of structures, the formulas that are built together. So, think about it as putting together a project where maybe you have to put together a toy of different plastic parts, but the plastic parts are already molded. You have enough of those parts, you can put it together into a robot, or an airplane, or whatever you want to do. The same idea, creating a structure. And then there's a relationship to the community. If I am printing a book, I don't know who's going to read that and how far it could go. I have no idea. Just have no idea. I have some books I have written that have been read by, I don't know, maybe 200 people in the world. Hardly anyone has read them. Like, not famous books. But I know people in China have read them. I know people in Europe have read them. I know people in Africa have read them. And I've never met these people. Right? I've never met these people. I have a book that is banned in another country. I don't know this person who banned it. Right? Never met them, but they read the book. They're able to access the book without me being there. That's not true before the printing press. Right? You have to bring oral literature before the community. Otherwise, they don't hear it. And so your audience is immediate. And even when you're writing a manuscript, you're writing a manuscript to preserve it over time. Still, that manuscript is assumed to be taken to a group of people who are also illiterate. Punctuation marks, periods, commas, questions, semicolons. Where do they come from? Did you ever wonder where they come from? Those marks started in manuscript culture days. They were added because most people couldn't read. So let's say that we have a manuscript and I'm the only person who can read it. I don't keep that knowledge to myself. I read it out loud to everyone there. And those marks were supposed to be clues for when to stop, when to pause, when to ask it like a question. Right? Because there's an assumption, as soon as you use punctuation, that it's public, right? That it's part of the community, right? And so automatically, medieval literature is presented to a community that is in some way immediate. Now, we're separate from that. We are, in many cases, centuries away from that. So we're not who they were thinking of, but we know they were thinking of someone, right? We know they were thinking of people they could walk up to and say this poem to. Right? By the way, that's not just true in the meta sense for literature itself, but also the kind of characters. So they kind of, this protagonist who's like alienated and, like, I'm on my own and I'm the tough guy, the superhero, right? This kind of figure, the cowboy. This kind of person really, when they represent themselves, that's very modern. When they have their own system of honor, that's very modern. When you have those kinds of people who are the superheroic person in medieval literature, they're acting on behalf of their king or their country or their clan or whatever it is. They're acting on behalf of the community. They're a representation of the community. So to give you two modern examples that you may know, because I've heard students talk about them. I know some of you have seen these Avenger movies, right? These superhero movies. Captain America is almost medieval. He exists in relationship to the American community. Whereas Iron Man, who's selfish, he has to learn, right? He's selfish. He's existing as an alienated genius superhero for himself. He's modern. Now, of course, over the course of the sweep of these stories, they will change places in some way. But that kind of Captain America figure is much more a kind of medieval figure. And so then what is good by what a hero does, whether they're a superhero or just a regular person who's making choices, depends on the relationship to the community, not to some sort of personal moral code, but a broader communitarian moral code. And the last of these that I want to talk about before we get to my colleagues here challenging me and punching me in the face is cyclical time and the authority of the past. Railroads did something very interesting. Railroads changed the world and how we think about time. When you got railroads, that was the first time you could go from this place to that place very, very quickly. And it's not just you can go from this place to that place very, very quickly, but more importantly, railroads needed a schedule. You needed to know the train will arrive at this time and will leave at that time. Before that time, before railroads came, if you asked someone what time it was, what did they do? They looked at the sky. But suddenly, with railroads, you need them to be precise. And so with railroads, we begin to do things like have time zones. So right now, it is a particular time in Uganda. And so we could say it is daytime in Uganda, it is nighttime in America where I'm from. In my hometown in America, it's nighttime right now. But I can say more than just that. Right? I can say, if right now it is 2:56 in Uganda, it is, what time is it? 6:56. Oh, I guess it's starting to be morning, right? It's 6:56 exactly in the morning in America, right? I can know exactly the time in America, and everyone who lives in this particular range says it's the same time, right? Linear time in this way is in many ways a product of the modern world. Before we get in the modern world, we don't see this. We don't see it as much, I should say. And so we often see two things. One is cyclical time. Things repeat. How many times have you heard a story, a long story, and then the thing that happens at the beginning repeats again? And we see this all the time where we'll see often in stories a repetition of three. First someone says this, and then someone says this, and then the third time changes everything, right? We see this in jokes very often. We'll see the same kind of things in jokes as well today, where time acts as a cycle. And so what came before doesn't only cause what comes after, but what comes after comes back in the circle and causes what comes before. And so because of that, your ancestors then end up being wiser than the descendants in many cases. Right? You can go to your ancestors and not say, you are primitive. You are primitive. But rather, it's part of the same cycle. My ancestors in some way come before me, but in some ways they also come after me as well. They come after me because time acts in these kinds of cycles. And so tradition then doesn't just constrain everything, but it is the grounding of everything, because that's how things, not just how things have been, but how things will often be. And this is true across time. So how many times have you read a work, a medieval work from around the world, or ancient or classical, and it starts with a genealogy. So-and-so was the father of so-and-so. He was the father of so-and-so. He's the father of so-and-so. He had 3 children, and they were this. Why is that important? Because that doesn't just define those people, it then defines us as well. And probably, this is not medieval, it is classical. But if you think of the opening book of the New Testament, Matthew, it begins with the genealogy of Jesus, but because it's pointing out that genealogy was prophesied. So it isn't just from point A to B to C all the way down to Jesus, but also, by the way, please note that this was already prophesied that this was going to happen, right? And so we see this kind of connection. The past has authority over the present, And so in Christianity, how do you know that Jesus is who he says he will? Because he fulfilled prophecies that occurred before, right? The past, and then the past, he fulfills them in the present, and presumably fulfills them in the future. And these are just some of the common elements of medieval literature. So I'm going to close it there and offer up time for discussion. My colleagues, thank you for your attention today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Professor Nokes. I thought that was a very passionate, comprehensive, and indeed actually insightful. He said, now this is the time, I think I'm not going to recapitulate his lecture. I'll simply probably pick out some of my takeaways, and I think I have a couple of them. I'm not going to give details, and these are my own personal take. I'm very sure you have your own different takes. Reader response, remember? Okay, we start. Okay, so I also have a couple of questions, but I think after my little summary, I'll ask the students also to give their own main comments or questions. Then my colleagues, of course, will tune in and see how we get a debate version. Something like that. Okay. So he gave us insightful ideas. For example, that he is funded by Fulbright, and he gave an explanation that he does actually education and cultural exchange. I think that you might want to ask him one of the questions after this. And then he tried to, I think he did as much as possible to unpack global medievalism. Of course, he summarized it as the Middle Ages, and he says this is between, so it appears between the classical and the modern, so in the middle there, so you have the medieval. And the time period, I think, he states as 500 to 1580, and he is concerned, of course, it's from America, some of those debates, that this has been too Europeanized. I have a different thing as well. I'm going to tell you that this is probably much more westernized. So America now become part of this other thing. And yet his argument is that this belongs to the entire globe. So the entire world have a place in the medieval period, and including Uganda. I think I've given many illustrative examples to support that case. Then the moment I think he offered a very mildly intriguing perspective in which he called features of medievalism. So he talked about industrialization, mass literacy, nation state, and so on and so forth. So I have a question there, because he talked about the kingdom as the major part of this course in this course. Then of course he talked about the printing press. I think this is something maybe we need to look at. I think he gave an elaborate aspect of the trends and patterns. I think this is again my own take on what I think his suggestion was. He talked about the Islamic pattern. The Islamic Golden Age, which is between the 8th and 13th centuries. And he calls Baghdad was the intellectual capital of the world then. And then I think there are many texts that he raised, but I think I picked one which is very familiar, Arabian Nights, another text mentioned. And then, of course, he also talked about that part in East Asia, and he talked about the Tang Dynasty, between 7th to 10th centuries. And of course, what's key here is that you have a flourishing of lyrical poetry. And I think there are many texts, but I think I picked one called The Tale of Genji, which of course is in Japan. Then he went on to look at, I think he was illustrating the idea that medievalism is a global thing. So picking from different parts of the world to illustrate that. Then he went down to the Americas. And here again, I was waiting to hear him mention, for instance, a seminal text from the United States of America, or maybe from Canada. But I think I got stuff from, he talked about the pre-Columbian tale, which is the Prof. Fu. I already saw, maybe I'm going to read it, which is from South America. Then he went on to mention, I think he came to Africa now to bring the story home. And so you have West Africa, and Sundiata, Elvin is mentioned, and I think this is one which I was very happy to deliver to his class as a guest lecturer, I think last year. And then we went on to, we also Uganda, pre-colonial Ugandan kingdoms as medieval societies, that was also pretty covered. They talked about the living archive, and then of course that elaborate discussion on the archetype, character types, form structures and images. I think there is a student who does really study where the archetypes is one of the concepts. Maybe this is our time to ask you questions, so maybe seek more clarification. And then he talked about the oral manuscript, the texts which are here, composed, transmitted, and performed, or even handwritten. And he went on to say, in terms of subject matter, I think that these medieval texts might have a religious aspect. So religiosity, I think, is a major thing. Then, of course, kingship and kingdoms as political ones when it comes to politics, rather than the subject matter. These medieval texts, I think, talk about kings and kingdoms, and so on. And then I think these were part of the features of the medieval texts. Then the formulaic compositions, where, of course, you have formulas, repetitions, and so forth. And I think here there was a catchphrase that when you read a text and there are so many repetitions, that's not the dance, it's actually the structured writing and so on and so forth. And the second article, so it talks about the community as intended audience. So these texts might have the community in mind, so that these are probably the ones who are going to benefit from that. And then finally, the pastiness of medieval texts. So they never talk about the present or the future, but they are rooted so much into history and the past. And I thought that was very, very good. I want to thank you so much for that presentation. This is thank the students for the audience. And now, this is time. I would also want us to finish on time, just end by 4. So I'm going to give students maybe 6, choose 6 students. Then I also have time to have my colleagues, including myself, give questions. Thank you so much, and invite the students' questions. Anyone, question?
Feel free. You get like me, 2 months more than that. I can question. Ask your
Or a comment?
this one. Just a comment. Say what you done, for example.
I'll give someone there, those who are teaching to ask a question.
Cassie, would you be so kind? Sorry. Would you be so kind as to both give this to the gentleman who is so brave as to be the first person, and also to the young lady. Oh, did she leave already? Who? She's around. Yes. Well, let's pass that along to her. So we have a little pen for the university.
Someone else was saying, I'll give you mine.
Thank you very much. My name is Kawan Mahdi, student in literature doing my master's here at Kyambogo. My question is that, is it true for me to believe that in regards to religious cosmology and the organization and the organizing framework is linked to the community as the intended audience in terms of the authorship of the Bible and the Quran?
So I guess it depends on what it means by, is it true, do you have to believe that? If you're asking, do you have to believe the claims of the Bible, the Quran, or any other ancient, classical, or medieval text, no, you don't have to believe anything in them. But if the question is, did the people at that time think about, hey, I'm telling I'm writing something for such and such a time, for such and such a people. And I think you not only is it true for medieval texts, but it's true for those texts as well. So if you take the Quran, for example, Orthodox Islamic belief is that the Quran was written before creation, right? But it's only revealed at a particular time. Well, if it's revealed at that particular time, then it is written for that particular community to be revealed at that particular time, right? In the Bible as well, it's full of, say, for example, epistles, where like the Apostle Paul will say, hey, I actually left my coat there. Please have someone bring it to me. We very much have this idea of a connectivity to the community. And even when we don't have ones that say this explicitly, there is almost always in medieval texts an assumption that you and I agree on our religious cosmology. There's a presupposition that you and I are in agreement. We all know that these are the gods, or that there is one God, or that this is our relationship to a church, or this is how we should pray, or such and such, right? There's an assumption that audience agrees with you. And there aren't that many, there are a few, but there aren't that many sources that are like, hey, I'm a foreigner talking to you, or I'm bringing you something from a foreign land. We do have some of those, and they're really interesting, but even then it's, I'm bringing something to you. In some ways, what I wrote today, what I presented to you today, was a part of that same thing. How much did I talk about Uganda? A lot. Why? Because I'm speaking for a community of people who live in Uganda. And I mentioned a couple times Tang Dynasty poetry. I didn't even mention, I think, a single poet, right? Because most of you aren't familiar with that and it wouldn't resonate. So, do you have to agree with the religious presuppositions of whatever that religion is? No. But I do think you have to accept that, like, the people who wrote that, or to whom it was revealed to, were for a particular community at a particular time. Now, can you say, well, obviously, in the case of, say, the Bible, the Quran, certain other kinds of ancient books, they still have an effect today, right? But even when we say they have an effect today, we assume that they were written for us, like for me, right? If I'm doing Bible study, a Bible study is different from a study of, say, Shakespeare. I don't think Shakespeare's writing to me. But if I'm doing a Bible study, I'm supposed to believe that this is about me, my church community, as much as it's about them. If that makes any sense.
Thank you very much. A key takeaway is that I believe that there is a very big similarity between the Jewish God and then the Greek God and the African demigod. Maybe take home, think about it in terms of the literatures written around such perspectives.
Someone is behind.
Good afternoon, everyone. Josh is my name. Following. My question cuts across to the coding characteristics and whereby community is the intended audience, and then the cyclical time and authority of the past. Now, my area of interest is the Bible. Okay? I've always questioned events in the Bible. I ask myself, are they really intended for me? First and foremost, from a very strong Christian background, and I look at the people of the Bible back in the day. God says, go wash yourself with ash, cry, toil. Bishop, I can't do that. So, can I show I'm not the intended audience? Thank you very much.
sorry, I missed the last thing you said. Making sure what now?
I am asking, do I have that authority to distance myself from bringing the audience to the text? Yeah.
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, so there's two issues here. One is a religious issue and one is not a religious issue, right? Most medieval literature is not, in the way we would think about it, they're writing as a holy book. But they do consider the gods, they all share the same idea of the gods, whether it's a single god or multiple gods, right? They all have the same ideas. But they don't have that distinction between this is religious literature and this is secular literature. So from a scholarly perspective, you could separate yourself from it. It doesn't matter, right? So like, I can study medieval. So I am myself a Christian. I can study medieval Islamic literature, and as a Christian, I don't believe that applies to me, right? Or I can study medieval Buddhist literature, and as a Christian, I can say that does not apply to me. In fact, I might even say, I don't believe in Buddhism, so therefore I don't believe it applies to anyone, right? But certainly that community that received that, someone said it to them, someone wrote it down, they certainly believed that it applied to them. Now, often when we're talking about explicitly religious texts, they then presume this cyclical cosmology. So, I think you mentioned that you were a Christian, is that what you said? Yes, no?
Yes.
Okay. So, for example, we see not just that Jesus appears in the Bible, but that Jesus is prefigured. That you get these mysterious figures like Melchizedek, like the figure who appeared in the lion's den. I'm sorry, not in the lion's den. With Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the furnace, right? You get these figures that prefigure Jesus, right? And you also get in the Bible a revelation that, by the way, Jesus is coming back, right? Past, present for them, future as well, right? If we look at the Popol Vuh has their creation myth. It's really interesting. They believe that time runs on, I forget, it's like 12,000 years. I'm sorry, I can't remember the exact number of years. Time runs in cycles. And the gods keep creating people. And so because of that, in the first creation cycle, gods create one man out of mud. But he is made from mud. And so he can't hold together. And so he tries to praise the gods, but then he falls apart, right? He's just mud, right? And so that whole creation cycle goes by with one man. So then the gods decide that they're going to create creatures out of plants. And they create the animals out of plants. And the animals don't fall apart. The animals run around, right? They run around, but the animals don't speak. And so they'll praise the gods. And so the gods don't like that. So after that creation cycle, the gods create mannequins out of wood. And those mannequins become monkeys. And monkeys, in their cosmology, monkeys can talk and they can build cities. If you're thinking, wow, do they really talk? Monkeys talk in South America? They do not. But in their stories, they do. They can talk and they can build cities, but they don't honor and praise the gods. And then finally, out of corn, out of maize, they create humanity. And humanity, we are the first creation that does what we're supposed to. And we exist, we hold together, and we praise the gods. However, the first humans are too powerful, and they can see the future, and they can see the past. And so the gods blind us to the future. The gods blind us to the future, so we can only remember the past, and we can only guess at the future. And then, that cycle was supposed to come to an end in 2012. So many people thought that 2012 is the end of the world because the Mayan calendar will change. And in case you're not clear on this, in 2012, the world did not come to an end. We are still here. If you don't, write that down. That's important to remember. If you don't remember that, write that down. But the idea was that life is going to continue to go in a cycle. Do you have to personally believe that creation keeps coming in cycle after cycle after cycle? No. But when you're studying it, you have to understand that this audience believed that. They believed in these cycles. And that they were living near the end of one cycle, and another cycle was going to happen.
There's a fan behind you and another one.
So me, I'm going to say what I have learned from this session. First of all, I want to appreciate our facilitator and also our lecturers and students who are around. So I've learned that the debut period is the time in between. For example, when we get the first one being the first and then the middle one is the debut period and the modern literature. And then I remember our facilitator disagreed with us to call it the pre-modern, because when we call it pre-modern literature, we are including classical literature and medieval period all together. So he prefers to only refer to it as part the medieval period. Then the other thing I've learned is part of the common elements of the global medieval literature. One thing I learned is the religious cosmology. This means that in most literature there is an impact of the gods. Even when they talk about the gods or they don't talk about the gods, it is portrayed maybe the gods are the reason. Okay, they are inspired with what they are writing about. And then the other thing is the community being the intended audience. This means like the protagonists of this medieval literature, at times they write what we want to say. You get, they either write on behalf of us. For example, they can write as the king, as the person, or they write to us. We are the intended audience. We're supposed to learn from what they have written. Then the last thing I've learned is archetype. Is this how it is? Archetype, yeah. That one, yeah. So it is, I've understood it in the format of maybe it is the recurring events in literature. For example, the poem you gave us, it cuts across all literatures, all cultures. For example, the Americans will write about something which talks to us, also as Ugandans, you get. So most times it's intended to like point out those crucial issues which are all around the globe. Thank you.
What's your name?
Tanya Stephen. Stephen Campbell.
Thank you very much. My question, my name is Umukiza Ilaita, second year student doing English and English. My question is going to rotate about legacy and modern legacy. Having known that the global medieval literature is that period between the classical and the modern, that is today. So my major concern is on legacy and its modern relevancy, as in the global medieval literature. So why do certain medieval texts continue to resonate today while others are lesser known outside their regions? A case in point, this question has been puzzling in my mind. Is it because maybe some playwrights or authors are known that maybe when they publish their work, it's very easy? For instance, a person has studied literature. For instance, let's look at the classical bit of it. When they talk of Homer, at least you will get to know the Iliad, you get to know the Odyssey, and maybe some of the events that happened. So we will come to know him as someone who has really written some good work. So is it because that maybe some of these authors or playwrights, as in those who write poems, are not known? Or is it because that in the present day or the modern world, maybe we have influence of technology, talk of the artificial intelligence, and it has undermined us maybe the students to maybe over rely on it instead of using it fruitfully to make maybe research and maybe come up with something outstanding. Thank you very much.
Can I ask you to clarify your question? Is the short version of your question, why would people today be interested in the medieval? Is that the short version? Or no? Give me the shortest version. I heard everything, but I wasn't sure what the question you were asking.
Okay. Why do certain medieval texts continue to resonate today, while others are lesser known outside their regions?
This is a really good question. And you said you've been struggling with it? I hope you come up with an answer because I've been struggling with it for a long, long time. So I think there are two parts to the answer that I think, the first one I'm not very confident in, but I do think is true. The second one I'm pretty confident. The first one is, as you get to more and more ancient texts, they sometimes become harder and harder to understand. And I think one of the reasons that the medieval generally, not specific texts yet, but generally the medieval resonates with us is it's far enough away that it clearly is not our society right now, but it's close enough that we recognize it. And the further you go in the past, the harder it is to recognize, like, who are these gods they're talking about? You know, or what is this nation they're talking about? This kingdom hasn't existed for thousands of years. I don't know who these people are, and it's hard to resonate. So I think, generally speaking, one of the reasons that broadly medieval texts are still powerful today is we're just close enough to recognize them, and just far enough away to not feel like we're constrained by our own modern presuppositions of life. Now, the second part, though, is why is this text so popular and that text no one reads anymore? I think the reason, there's obviously some texts are better than others, right? If I gave you 2 books that were written in 2026, one book you might say that book, well, that book is just dumb. Right? I don't like that book. That book's stupid. And another book you might say that book spoke to me because it was a better book, right? Not because of anything particular about the culture. There's some books are better than others. And that's true throughout time, right? However, also, there's the issue of what is in print. If something has not been translated and not put into print, you cannot read it. You cannot study it. And so other people who come after it can't use it to influence their own work. And so the longer it takes for a work to be translated into a modern language or into your modern language, for you to understand, the less influence it's going to have, the less it's going to affect things. Now, and that's actually partly financial, right? If there's an audience of 2,000 people for this book, it's not going to get published because that's not enough people. If 100,000 people are going to do it, it will. If a book is going to become a book of any kind of literature, it's going to become a standard part of the curriculum, it's going to get published and everyone's going to read it. So, for example, I could go right now to a place that sells books here in Uganda, and I could buy a book, and a book might cost me, 50,000 shillings, right? To say an example price, right? A book can be expensive. But if that book becomes adopted as part of the Ugandan national curriculum, suddenly a student edition of that book will be published, for maybe 10,000 shillings. Why? Did that book become better all of a sudden? No, it's because the publishers know, well, we'll sell, thousands and thousands of copies of this book if we do it this way. So we can make money by publishing a cheap edition. That book does not suddenly resonate more, but it has more of an impact because of that financial decision. Now you add, and this is true for all ancient classical medieval texts as well, right? if it's not translated to a modern language or not many people are going to read it, it cannot have an impact no matter how powerful it is. Now, you ended by asking about AI and stuff. And I think now we're getting into something really complicated. I said to you, this is going to maybe offend my colleagues here. So if the other lecturers attack me, I rely on you to defend me. All right? And I mean physically attack me. I see a knife. I see a knife. Okay. And we define, in terms of literature, we define the beginning of modern literature with the novel. With the printing press. With the printing press, suddenly you can have things like novels, right? You can have universal literacy. You can have all kinds of things. I think today we may be in a new period of literature. I think that the digital text, the ability to mass produce an infinite number of a text, will probably completely change literature itself. How we think about literature, how we think about the relationship between literature and image, the relationship between literature and the audience, the relationship between the author and the audience, all those things are going to change. And just like in the days of manuscripts, you couldn't have novels. You can't have novels. Why don't we have any African novels that come before the printing press? Before the Europeans come? Because we also don't have any European novels before the printing press. It's hard to have a novel because someone has to copy that by hand. Or people have to memorize the whole thing. But if you can print it, you can simply have novels. So whole new genres of literature exist. I think we may be looking at whole new genres of literature. And so what you said at the end about what about AI and things like that, I think that is also going to, in the future, affect these things. Will I see it in my lifetime? No. Will you see it in your lifetime? Probably not. But if we go forward 100 years, 200 years for sure, we'll be able to see the change that's happening as it's happening.
Thank you so much, Professor. Actually, I'm one of the youngest students because I'm a student of Professor in creative writing. And I want to give you a testimony that Professor has really done a great job here in Uganda. Thank you so much, Professor. Mine is very simple, Professor. What do you think is the representation of women in the medieval literature? And what do you say of it? Because I think how have it influenced the writing of the modern literature? Because to me, I think modern writers, like specifically ladies, are actually writing to prove that what was represented in the medieval literature is actually not actually true. How do you think medieval literature has actually influenced the writing of the modern literary work? Thank you.
This is working? Okay, good. So, first of all, I want you students to all remember that when you're coming up to your examinations, it's very useful to publicly praise your lecturer before you march your examination. Very wise, very prudent move there, so good job. So, the representation of women in medieval literature is complicated. It is, of course, a representation of women within those cultures. And so how women are represented in those cultures, or how the position of women in those cultures will affect the way that they are presented in literature. So for example, in the northern Germanic Viking cultures, for example, in those cultures, women could hold property, women were often leadership positions. Women could make contracts. Women had full legal rights. And so interestingly enough, the representations of women in there are of very strong, powerful figures. However, also interestingly enough, the representations of men are very, very masculine men, hyper masculine men. And I think the reason for that is when you are a powerful woman, you still want a man who you can see as even more masculine than you. And so you start to see these like very hyper masculine depictions of men because the women have so much authority. So a good example of this would have been, to a lesser degree, you have that kind of culture in England. I'm going to use this as an example because many of you study the British tradition. Until the coming of the Normans. And then when the Norman conquest happens, they bring a culture with them where women have no right to own property, women cannot enter into contracts, women cannot, as we would think about it, women cannot testify in court. And so suddenly, the men's behavior, men are fainting a lot more and are swooning, the men become a lot more feminized in that. And so the depiction of women depends on the men. The depiction of women depends on their position in society. But I would say also the depiction of men in those literatures also depends, ironically, not on the position of men, but on the position of women in the society. Now, interestingly enough, as far as we can tell, the first person to be able to make a living by writing literature, the first person in the world who was able to support herself is a woman. Her name is Christine de Pizan, and she wrote an extremely popular book that she was able to sell copies of and supported herself. She was a widow. She's an aristocratic widow. She supported herself through this. And so on the one hand, she lived at a time when she was able to make money and make a living by writing. But on the other hand, her book is called The Book of the City of Ladies. And it's imagining a metaphorical city that's all women, where they basically say, hey men of literature, you haven't treated us right. This is how women should be depicted. So on the one hand, the first person to make a living writing is a woman. On the other hand, she's saying, but you haven't done a good job at depicting how women are. So I think that the women who enter into this, who say, I don't like the way that women are depicted in literature, modern or medieval or classical or ancient or whatever, they're not doing anything modern, actually. They're engaging in a very, very old tradition. They're engaging in a very, very old tradition. And we see this even, so like the Tale of Genji, the main character is male. However, it's written by Seisho Nagon, Murasaki Shikibu. Seisho Nagon's another woman writer at the same time in Japan. So it's a woman writer who's writing about male characters also. So I think every culture is going to be a little bit different. It's going to depend on the cultural presuppositions of that. But I think it's not enough to say, and thus women are depicted in such and such a way. I think we also see that as those cultures are different, men are also depicted in such and such a way. So that the relationships between men and women are, I think, more contingent upon how women are depicted than they are contingent upon how men are depicted, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Prof. And also thank you, the students, for those very good questions. I hope other people probably are thinking about asking some. Now it's time for us to also interact with you. I think they will open the thing. So I have 3 questions to ask you. And the spirit in which I'm asking the first question is based on, the spirit is, me as a literary scholar in Africa, I know medievalism, or maybe medieval literature. So the idea of global medievalism is actually very from you, so you didn't have it. But from your presentation and also the various things you just mentioned, so at some point in your discussion, your presentation, you came across some way saying all of it is medieval and non-European, not influenced by Europe. Is that the comment you mentioned?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that again?
So in your presentation, I think you made a comment in which I think one of the issues you discussed, which is characteristics maybe of medieval literature, you say all of it is medieval and not influenced by Europe. And of course you have mentioned that this is too Europeanized. This seems to suggest that this is much more about Europe and medievalism. But then, given the presentation, the way you presented your work, you also talked about, for instance, when it comes to the audience, talking about the community, talking about kingship, and so on and so forth. Now, I realize, for instance, if you're talking about Europe, so the kingship and the monarchical system of governance is much rooted in Europe, maybe in some other parts in Africa, West Africa especially. And here, of course, in East Africa, Uganda, so you had Bunyoro and many other kingdoms. So how do you then reconcile, if you're going to say that there is something called global medievalism, and given those characteristics you've given, how do you then reconcile the idea? Because if the subject matter is going to be about kingdoms and monarchies, and we know America, for example, one of the reasons why the American War happened, you wanted to part ways with Imperial Britain and England. So, don't you think somehow it is fair to suggest that this was a European issue and not maybe any other part of the world, especially if those areas did not have, for example, a monarchical system of governance? So that's the first question. And I also wanted to ask, don't you think that your scholarship is at least implicitly maybe dictated by an attempt to debunk the idea that medievalism is maybe a European something, and maybe there is something to include other parts of the world? And then the other question is, so I've read something from the Global Middle Ages Initiative Center, which sort of like comes up with these contents with this medieval globalism. The argument is that, for example, the time frame 500 to 1500 AD is rather European. In fact, they use that one that this is a Western time frame and a form of what? Epistemological neocolonialism. So do you think if you're now going to agree that this is global medievalism, would you want us to stick by 500 to 1500 AD? Would that seem some? And then finally, for me, you somehow, because if you read works of literature, especially with respect to influences, if I can look at, for example, Shakespeare, so you say he's been influenced by classical literature and many other things. And of course, I know Shakespeare writes between 1600 onwards. So do you think maybe the position of the medieval period, especially between the classical and also the modern, disadvantages when it comes to influences on contemporary literary production and also scholarship? Because Shakespeare would have been, because he writes shortly after the medieval period, wouldn't he have benefited so much from medievalism? But we tried to look at the classical influences of Shakespeare and not what the medieval scholars have actually addressed him. So those are the three questions I'm going to ask you. Thank you. So I will also give my colleagues a chance to ask you more questions. Make sure you give tough questions.
I did have a question, but maybe a comment. Let me see, I wrote it somewhere. All right, so let me check myself properly. So, if I say that culture is what you know, am I right? That's the definition of the word culture. And that the modern era begins with the moment of literal contact with the rest of the world. So what's the difference between globalization, and medievalism. That's the only question. That's it.
Okay, so thank you, gentlemen, for those questions. I like hostile questions from this group. So, Mr. Babatrashi said, I think quoted me, and I will not deny that I might have said this. If I said this, I misspoke. Okay. That all these things are, all these characteristics I showed are medieval, but they're not influenced by Europe. Right? If I said that, that was not what I meant. What I meant to say is they are not necessarily European. They're not necessarily European. By which I mean to say, like, those same characteristics occur everywhere in the world, even in places that had no contact with Europe. And so there's nothing particularly European about it. Now, you asked if in some way the project of global medievalism is trying to debunk the idea of the European Middle Ages, right? And I do think that is not a goal of it, because the European Middle Ages are just as much a part of the Middle Ages as the rest of the world, right? It's not then not European, everything else, right? I think that's one of the mistakes that people often make. But rather, it's part of this kind of global idea. However, because people often have it in their minds, they have these images in their mind, it then also sometimes means you sometimes have to first say, like, this is not what we mean by this. So when I give the years 500 to 1500, I use that as an example of something that happens in part of Europe. It is definitely not true for most of the world. And in fact, that's not even true for Europe. What do I mean by that? Well, if we're talking about the classical era, strictly speaking, ending with the fall of the Roman Empire, well, the Roman Empire was a Mediterranean empire. So southern and central Europe, and North Africa, and much of the Middle East are included in that. Egypt's included in that, also because of the conquest of Alexander the Great. That would all be part of that. But Northern Europe isn't part of that. Central Europe isn't part of that. Even Russia, the European part of Russia, is not part of that. Africa, once you get south of the Sahara, is not part of that. So it's not even, those years are just used as, in this place, that's how we define it. Just like in China, there's a debate about the end of the Han Dynasty or the beginning of the Tang Dynasty. That doesn't apply to the Americas, or to Europe, or to Uganda. So if I did not mean to imply this, because one of my critiques of the way, I'll really make it look bad. One of my critiques of the way that post-colonial theory is applied is it still ends up being all about Europe. It still ends up being about when Europe shows up, right? But if I can jump ahead to something that my colleague Mr. Ngume said, isn't this also then about when cultures connect, that this is really about globalization? And in some cases, it is. Not in every case, right? In some cases, the change had to do with some other change that happened in that culture that had nothing, that was entirely internal, right? Some internal thing developed and suddenly the whole society changed. In other cases, and definitely the case of Uganda, it's also the moment of globalization. So for example, I would argue that a lot of what is pointed to as this is the result of colonization in not just Uganda, but in Africa. Sometimes it's actually more just the result of modernization coming with globalization and happens to be at all part of the same mass of things. It has nothing particular to do with the British in that way. They just happen to be the people that showed up. In the same way that the Spaniards are the people who showed up in what we call Mexico today, or Guatemala, and that was where that started, and etc. I would also, though, by the way, this is going to get to I'm going to return to your issues. I'm going to disagree with you very strongly on something that you said. You said culture is the things that we know. I disagree with that a lot. And I think you might have said that, I don't know if you maybe heard a podcast where they asked me to define culture in the podcast, and I actually talked about that.
I will defend it some.
Okay, yeah. I think that culture is the things that the practices that we don't think about. It's not what we know, it's what we don't think about. It's normal to us without any consideration. You don't choose the things, you don't choose the things that you do. Now, does it definitely interface with knowledge? 100%, right? It has to connect with knowledge. But I think our culture is the unconscious things that we do without even considering it. So for example, very simple example. In America, you do not wear white socks with formal clothing. Wearing white socks with formal clothing is considered very, very poor taste, very bad. When I first went to live in Korea, everybody wore white socks with their, they wear a suit with they have a vest, and I'm sorry, what do you call a vest here? A three-piece suit? What do you call this thing? What do you call the middle thing in there? What do you call the middle piece?
A waistcoat.
A waistcoat. There you go. Okay, you say waistcoat. Sorry. We call it a vest, which you mean something different, right? A waistcoat. They have a waistcoat and a jacket, and very well pressed, and the best imported Italian shoes, and white socks, because they thought, well, that looks very sporty. That shows how sporty I am that I'm wearing white socks with this. And one day, I had a colleague say to me, like, I'm going to meet with some Americans for business. And I've been told not to wear white socks, that they'll think it looks stupid. And I said, yes, that's true. And then he asked an important question. Why? No reason. Unconscious reasons, right? It's totally like I had never considered why. I just knew, if you wear white socks, that looks stupid, right? To Americans, and they had just learned if you wear white socks, that shows that you're strong and athletic and sporty. Why would white socks mean that you're athletic? I don't know. Like, I was weak, and then I put on my white socks and I became strong, right? And I would say that is kind of I would say culture is more about the unconscious things. And the reason I say this is this gets to, I think, the really important question. So although I challenged although I said, like, look, if I say 500, 1,500, I'm not talking about every place. And therefore, if you import this to Uganda, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't work in Uganda at all, those years. It doesn't work in China also. It doesn't work in North Africa. It doesn't work in the Americas. It doesn't work. However, even though I've said, I think your argument was based upon a misunderstanding of what I said, or maybe I misspoke. I'm going to give you part of your argument, which is a problem I have in Uganda. The medieval is between two things. The modern is the easy thing. And in some cultures, like in India or in China or Japan, where we have very, very good records, we can say what would be classical Japan. We can say, well, that ends with this time, some things like that. But in the Americas, And sub-Saharan Africa, not all sub-Saharan Africa, but in some places in Africa, certainly Uganda, what is it between? What is the classical or the ancient? Where does that end? And in that case, I have no answer for Uganda at all. Now, what I've had to do is say like, well, I can know as soon as someone starts telling a story about lorries being unloaded, I know this is mine, right? Or where the warrior no longer has a spear but he has a gun, I know this is mine. But I don't know how far back I can go reliably. And in fact, I suspect that when we start publishing things, I'm going to have to be very honest about that. And in addition to that, I think you can certainly make claims that even in Uganda, there are going to be different parts where, well, this was happening in this part of the country, and that was happening in the other part of the country. I heard someone say, I don't think it was someone in our faculty, someone somewhere else said like, well, maybe you can start the beginning of the medieval when the Arab traders show up. I think that's way too late. I think it's way too late. But I can't give another beginning point, right? I don't have one for you. Maybe I'll have one eventually, but I kind of don't think so. And maybe some of you will have ideas, and I would love to hear those. Did I answer your last question? I can't read my own handwriting. Did I answer your third question?
You did answer.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. I think because of time, we want to ask just a quick one.
Thank you so much. My name is Karen Chimaranare. I've picked a lot from the session, a lot of things I didn't know and I didn't think anyone would be knowing. And because of all that, it drives me to my question that's a bit personal, but I'd like it for my own journey. What would you consider your greatest accomplishment?
So, usually the answer that we would give, of course, would be our children. But since you're talking about your own journey, I'm assuming you mean an academic accomplishment, not that. My children are not my greatest academic accomplishment. My children mostly don't like to read. They all went into different fields than mine, so I'm an academic failure when it comes to my children. My greatest accomplishment? Academically? Okay, I don't have a good answer for you, and your question comes at a very timely moment for me. Because last night, I was reading something where someone was boasting. My papers I have written have been cited such and such number of times. And they were very proud that their papers have been cited many times to show that they had a strong impact on the field. And my first thought at that moment was, how big of a loser do you have to be to count the number? I know I say that, but a lot of academics do it. And in fact, in some fields, they count them for promotion and things like that, right? But and I understand people doing it for that reason. Like, are you really counting them? Like, what's wrong with you? And you've actually challenged me with your question, because not only don't I have an answer, but I realize that the flip side of my question, what would you say is your greatest academic accomplishment, is if I make fun of the people who are counting their citations, what should I take joy in? So I'm going to give an answer which is going to sound cheesy, but it's the only one I can think of at the moment. And there's a cliche in online culture where someone will look for a treasure or something in the story and they'll say, well, maybe the real treasure was the friends we made along the way. And I could point to this article or this book or this thing that had a lot of impact or having Fulbright, which you should totally think about applying for. I can think about all those kinds of things. But I think probably the thing that I'm most proud of academically is where my students have gone. My students who have done really great things, some of whom I think will, over the course of their career, they will surpass me. I certainly hope they do. And I guess that's the same an academic answer as I'm most proud of my children. I'm most proud of my academic children. But I really do think that if the most important thing that the things that we do are to preserve, to create, preserve, and transmit knowledge. The creation of knowledge I can do by myself, but preserving that knowledge and transmitting it has to come through students. And I would say that because of that, ultimately that has to be the most important impact that we have. And I guess that would be my very cheesy, but the best I can come up with an answer.
Okay, so now I think we've come to the end of this session, and once again I want to thank you, Professor Nokes, for a very wonderful presentation. I also want to take this time to thank Jamie Nokes Namakula, which does the behind-the-scenes work. She's normally the unsung hero of these particular sessions. We rarely mention her, but she really does a very tremendous job. I also want to express my deep gratitude to my colleagues from the Department of Literature and Film Studies, and of course the best students the university has. Students in literature at whatever levels you are, for raising this occasion and for perspectives you've given. And our Professor Nokes is still around up to, I think, October. He's also an expert on AI, as I've already told you, and I think most of you missed that presentation. So he's a very approachable person. Anytime you meet him on campus, feel free to interact with him, ask him those questions. He's always happy to respond to them. And so I want to say I've come to the end of the session, and I want to wish you all the best. And the next time we call, make sure you come, like you've done, and I think we shall have a cultural moment outside for the interview. Thank you so much, and I think let's go outside for thank you.